I was 12 the summer it happened, the summer I learned that some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. It was the third week of July, a sweltering, sticky season in the rural corner of the state where my grandparents lived. My parents had sent me there for 2 weeks, an annual tradition meant to give them a break and me a dose of country air. I usually loved it. The freedom was intoxicating compared to my life in the suburbs. Here, days were measured by the sun's arc across the sky and the chirping of crickets, not the ticking of a clock. But that year felt different. My grandparents' house was a character in itself. It was a 2-story clapboard farmhouse, painted a pale yellow that had faded to the color of old butter. It stood on a gentle rise, surrounded by 5 acres of overgrown fields that eventually gave way to a dense, dark wall of pine trees. The house looked tired, as if it were slowly sinking into the earth under the weight of its own history. The paint was peeling, the porch swing groaned with the weight of a ghost, and the whole place had a particular smell, a mix of my grandmother's lavender soap, my grandfather's pipe tobacco, and the ever-present dampness of old wood. I was given the upstairs guest room, a space that felt both cozy and unsettling. It was at the far end of the hall, directly overlooking the backyard and the tree line beyond. The room was filled with my grandmother's forgotten treasures, a heavy oak dresser with a cloudy mirror, a rocking chair draped in a hand-stitched quilt, and a bookshelf crammed with faded hardcovers that smelled of vanilla and dust. The wallpaper depicted tiny, repeating floral patterns that, if you stared at them long enough in the dim light, seemed to writhe and squirm. A single large window, with a heavy, sash-style frame, was my only view of the outside world from up there. My grandparents were wonderful, gentle souls, but they operated on a schedule dictated by a lifetime of farm work. They rose with the sun and were in bed, without fail, by 9 o'clock. This left me with long, silent evenings to myself. By 9:30, the only sounds in the house were the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, and the creaks and groans of the old house settling for the night. I'd spend those hours reading, propped up on a mountain of pillows, lost in worlds of fantasy and adventure. The house was my castle, and the encroaching darkness outside was a moat I felt perfectly safe behind. The first strange thing happened on a Tuesday night. It was late, probably close to 11. A fat, yellow moon hung in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawn. I was deep into a book, so engrossed that the world around me had faded into a dull hum. Then I heard it. A sound from outside. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. It seemed to be coming from the direction of my window. My first thought was that it was a branch from the big oak tree that grew near the house, its fingers scraping against the glass in the breeze. But there was no breeze. The air was heavy and still, thick with the humidity of a midsummer night. The leaves on the oak were motionless silhouettes against the moonlit sky. I put my book down and listened, my body tense. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. It was deliberate. Too rhythmic to be natural. It wasn't the frantic pecking of a bird or the random scrape of a branch. It had a pattern, a cadence. I slid out of bed, my bare feet cold on the wide planked wooden floor. I crept to the window, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I felt a prickle of fear, the kind a kid gets when they're alone in an old, creaky house at night. It's just your imagination, I told myself. It's a woodpecker. A very confused, nocturnal woodpecker. I reached the window and peered cautiously through the glass, trying to look down and to the side, toward the source of the sound. I couldn't see anything. The tapping stopped the moment I got close. Silence descended again, thick and absolute. I stood there for a full 5 minutes, listening, waiting. Nothing. The only sound was my own breathing, a little too loud in the quiet room. I finally convinced myself it had been nothing, a fluke of acoustics, the house making one of its many strange noises. I went back to bed, but the spell of my book was broken. I couldn't concentrate. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle in the fields outside, made me jump. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, the memory of the strange, pattern tapping echoing in my dreams. The next night, I was on edge. I tried to read, but my ears were straining, listening for any sound from outside. I told myself I was being ridiculous, working myself up over nothing. 9 o'clock came, and my grandparents shuffled off to bed. The house settled into its usual nocturnal symphony of creaks and groans. 10 o'clock. 10:30. Nothing. I started to relax, a wave of relief washing over me. I had imagined it. It was just a creepy old house getting into my head. I picked up my book, and for a while, I managed to lose myself in the story again. And then, at precisely 11 o'clock, it started again. Tap. Tap tap. Tap. The exact same pattern, the same deliberate rhythm. It was coming from the window, from just outside the glass. This time, there was no rationalizing it away. This was not the house settling. This was not a bird. My blood ran cold. Someone, or something, was standing outside my second-story window, tapping on the glass. But that was impossible. The window was a good 15 feet off the ground, with nothing beneath it but my grandmother's rose bushes. There was no ledge, no trellis, no way for anyone to get up there. Fear, sharp and cold, shot through me. I didn't move from my bed this time. I just sat there, frozen, the book lying open in my lap. I listened. The tapping continued for about a minute, a persistent, patient rhythm against the glass. Then, as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. I stayed awake for hours after that, my eyes wide in the darkness, staring at the black rectangle of the window, expecting to see a face appear at any moment. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I was exhausted and pale. My grandmother noticed at breakfast. "You look like you've seen a ghost, child," she said, placing a plate of pancakes in front of me. I hesitated. How could I explain it? A man tapping on my second-story window? They would think I was having nightmares. They'd say I was reading too many scary books. But the fear from the night before was still a hard knot in my stomach. "I heard a noise last night," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Like someone was knocking on my window." My grandfather looked up from his newspaper, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Probably just that old oak branch, son. We need to trim it back. It scrapes the siding when the wind blows." There was no wind, I insisted, a little too quickly. My grandmother smiled her gentle, reassuring smile. "Old houses make all sorts of spooky sounds at night. You'll get used to them. It's just the house talking to you." They meant well, but their dismissal made me feel worse. It made me feel alone with my fear. That day, I did some investigating. I went outside and stood directly beneath my window. The ground was soft, covered in a thick layer of mulch around the rose bushes. I looked for footprints, for any sign that someone had been there. I found nothing. I stared up at the window. It was impossibly high. There were no footholds on the clapboard siding. The oak tree was at least 10 feet away, its branches reaching out but not close enough to touch the house. There was no ladder, no evidence of anything. My rational mind was at war with the terror I had felt. It didn't make sense. But I knew what I had heard. The third night, I was prepared. I wasn't going to be a passive victim. I decided I wouldn't turn on my lamp. I would sit in the dark and wait. If the tapping started, I would rush to the window and try to see who or what was out there. My heart hammered against my ribs as the hours ticked by. The house fell silent. The moon rose. I sat in the rocking chair, shrouded in darkness, my eyes fixed on the window. 11 o'clock came and went. Nothing. 11:30. Still silence. A part of me was relieved, but another, more paranoid part, was even more scared. The change in the pattern was unsettling. I was just about to give up, to convince myself that this whole thing had been a figment of my overactive imagination, when I saw it. At the edge of the property, where the overgrown lawn met the dark, impenetrable line of pine trees, a figure emerged. It was a man. He was too far away to make out any features, but I could see his silhouette clearly in the moonlight. He was tall and thin. He just stood there, at the edge of the woods, perfectly still, and he was looking directly at the house. Directly at my window. He didn't move. He didn't wave or call out. He just stood and stared. A cold dread washed over me, a feeling so primal and deep it felt like ice water flooding my veins. This was him. The man who had been tapping on my window. I didn't know how he did it, but I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was him. I scrambled away from the window, my back hitting the wall, and slid down to the floor. I sat there in the dark, my knees pulled up to my chest, trembling. I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, listening. I didn't hear the tapping that night. Just the oppressive silence. After about half an hour, I crept back to the window and peeked over the sill. He was gone. The edge of the woods was empty again. He was there again the next night, and the night after that. The tapping on the window never returned. Instead, this silent, terrifying vigil became the new routine. Every night, around 11, he would step out of the woods and stand there, a motionless sentinel, his gaze fixed on my room. I stopped trying to read. I stopped even trying to sleep. I would just wait for him, my stomach in knots, and watch him from the darkness of my room until he decided to melt back into the trees, usually an hour or two later. I knew I had to tell my grandparents, but I was paralyzed by the fear that they wouldn't believe me. How could I explain this? A man stands in our woods and stares at my window every night? It sounded like the plot of a cheap horror novel. They would tell me it was a neighbor, or a hunter, or my imagination. They would tell me not to worry. And their disbelief, their calm rationalizations, felt almost as scary as the man himself. It meant I was truly alone in this. The breaking point came on Saturday, my last weekend there. Something new happened. The house had an old, dust-covered intercom system, a relic from the 70s. There was a master unit in the kitchen and smaller speaker boxes in each of the bedrooms, including mine. It hadn't worked in years, according to my grandfather. The wiring was shot, he'd said. We never used it. That night, the man was in his usual spot at the edge of the woods. I was watching him from my dark room, my usual ritual of silent terror. Suddenly, the speaker box on the wall next to my bed crackled. A burst of static hissed into the silent room, making me jump out of my skin. I stared at the yellow plastic grill, my heart seizing in my chest. More static. And then a voice. A low, raspy whisper, distorted by the ancient speaker. "I see you," it whispered. I couldn't breathe. The voice was thin and reedy, like the sound of dry leaves skittering across pavement. It was coming from the wall, but it felt like it was being whispered directly into my ear. I looked wildly from the intercom to the window. The figure was still there, a black cutout against the trees. He hadn't moved. How could he be talking to me? "You shouldn't hide in the dark," the voice crackled again. "It's not polite." A scream was trapped in my throat, a physical thing I couldn't force out. I scrambled out of my room and flew down the hallway to my grandparents' bedroom. I burst through the door without knocking, sobbing, unable to form coherent words. They woke up in a state of confusion and alarm. It took me 10 minutes to calm down enough to explain what had happened. I told them everything: the tapping, the man in the woods, the voice on the intercom. My grandfather, a practical man, went to investigate. He checked my room, fiddled with the intercom, and then went downstairs. He came back a few minutes later, his face etched with a mixture of concern for me and tired exasperation. "The intercom is dead, son," he said gently. "The main unit isn't even plugged in. The wire must have picked up some stray radio signal, maybe a trucker CB. It can happen with old wiring." He had an explanation for everything. He went outside with a powerful flashlight and swept the beam across the edge of the woods. "No one there," he announced when he came back inside. "You had a bad dream, that's all." A nightmare. They let me sleep on a cot in their room that night. But I knew it wasn't a dream. Their refusal to believe me was a special kind of horror. It made me question my own sanity, but deep down, I knew what was real. The man was real. The voice was real. And I was in terrible danger. Sunday was my last full day. I spent it in a fog of anxiety. I begged my parents to come get me a day early, but my grandparents insisted I was just homesick and that one more good night's sleep would do me wonders. They promised to leave their door open. They were trying to be comforting, but their calm demeanor felt like a wall I couldn't break through. They couldn't see the wolf that was circling their house. That night, I lay awake in my own bed. My grandparents had insisted I try to be a brave soldier. The door to my room was wide open, as was theirs down the hall. A small night light in the hallway cast a weak, orange glow. It was meant to be comforting, but it only created more shadows for my mind to play with. I didn't look at the window. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing him there. I just stared at the ceiling, listening. The house was quieter than usual, or maybe my hearing was just more acute. I could hear the faint whistle of my grandfather snoring from down the hall. I could hear the buzz of a moth bumping against the screen of the living room window downstairs. Then, just after midnight, the intercom crackled to life again. I flinched, pulling the covers up to my chin. I waited, my entire body rigid. The static hissed for a few seconds, and then the whisper came, clearer this time, more intimate. "Last night," it said. "It's our last night to play." My breath hitched. This wasn't a stray radio signal. This was a message for me. "I'm tired of being outside," the voice continued, its tone dropping into something colder, flatter. "I'm coming in now." That was it. That was the moment the floor dropped out from under me. The flimsy shield of denial I'd been clinging to, the hope that this was all a misunderstanding, a prank, a dream, shattered into a million pieces. This was real. He was coming inside. And then I heard it. A sound from downstairs. A sharp, cracking noise, followed by the faint tinkle of breaking glass. It was the sound of the small window in the downstairs bathroom, the one my grandfather always left unlocked because the latch was broken. Panic, pure and undiluted, seized me. I was off the bed in an instant, my mind screaming. I didn't run to my grandparents. He was downstairs. He was between me and them. My only thought was to secure my room. I slammed my bedroom door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent house. The old lock was a simple skeleton key type. I fumbled with it, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit the key in the hole. I turned it. The faint click of the lock sliding into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. But I knew it wouldn't be enough. The door was old, the frame was weak. I looked around the room in a frenzy. The heavy oak dresser. It was my only chance. Fueled by adrenaline, I pushed and scraped the monstrous piece of furniture across the floor, grunting with the effort. It moved agonizingly slowly. Every sound it made felt like a beacon, announcing my location. I finally got it wedged against the door, blocking it completely. I backed away from the door, my chest heaving, and then I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate creaks on the staircase. He was coming up. Each step was a lifetime. Creak. Pause. Creak. He knew the house. He knew its sounds. He was taking his time, savoring it. I scrambled for a hiding place, my eyes darting around the room. The closet. It was deep, filled with my grandmother's old winter coats that smelled of mothballs. I slipped inside, pulling the door almost shut, leaving only a tiny crack to see through. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They paused. I could hear his breathing now, a faint, wheezing sound just outside in the hall. He was right there. Then, the intercom in my room crackled again, so loud in the suffocating silence it made me bite my tongue to keep from screaming. "Where are you?" the whisper hissed, this time filled with a cruel, playful curiosity. Come out, wherever you are." He knew I was in here. The barricaded door had told him everything he needed to know. The doorknob began to jiggle. First gently, then more insistently. He rattled it back and forth. Silence. Then, a heavy thud as he threw his shoulder against the door. The old wood groaned in protest. Thud. The frame splintered. I could see the door bowing inward. He was going to break it down. I knew in that moment that I was going to die. He would break through the door, and he would find me, and that would be the end. All the air left my lungs. A primal terror I had never known existed took over. I opened my mouth and I screamed. It wasn't a child's cry for help. It was a raw, desperate, animal sound of pure fear, a sound that ripped from the deepest part of my soul. I screamed and screamed, not even stopping for breath. The thudding on the door stopped. I heard a noise from down the hall, my grandfather shouting. "Hey! Who's in my house? I've got a gun!" He didn't have a gun, but his voice was a booming roar of righteous fury. It was the voice of a man defending his home. For a moment, there was absolute silence outside my door. Then I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were fast, retreating. A panic scrambled down the stairs. The sound of the back door slamming open and then shut. And then silence. I stayed in the closet, shaking uncontrollably, for what felt like an hour before my grandfather, after calling the police, finally managed to force my door open enough to get in. He found me huddled in the back of the closet, unable to speak, tears streaming down my face. The police came, two tired-looking officers who seemed more annoyed than concerned. They took a report. They found the broken bathroom window and muddy footprints on my grandmother's clean linoleum floor. They found more prints outside, leading from the back of the house and disappearing into the woods. But there was nothing else. No fingerprints, no clues, no suspect. Just the story of a terrified 12-year-old boy. To them, it was just another call, a likely prank that got out of hand. They told my grandparents to fix the lock on the bathroom window and left. My parents drove up the next morning to get me. I didn't say a word the entire car ride home. The world that had seemed so safe and predictable just a few days before had been revealed as a thin veneer over something dark and predatory. I never spent another night at my grandparents' house. We would visit for the day, but by the time the sun began to set, a cold knot of panic would form in my stomach, and I would have to leave. The experience left a permanent scar. For years I had horrific nightmares. I couldn't sleep without a light on. The sound of a branch scraping a window, or the hiss of static from a speaker could send me into a full-blown panic attack. I became obsessed with locks, checking and rechecking every door and window in our house before I could even think about going to bed. The man was never caught. We never found out who he was, or why he had chosen me. He was just a faceless shape in the dark, a whisper from a dead speaker. The lack of answers was a special kind of torment, a wound that could never properly heal because the weapon was still out there, somewhere. My grandparents sold the house a few years after my grandfather had a stroke. They moved into a small retirement community in a nearby town. A new family, with young children of their own, bought the old farmhouse and did extensive renovations. I tried not to think about it, tried to bury the memory under the weight of years and new experiences. I thought I had succeeded, for the most part. The terror had faded to a dull, persistent anxiety, a permanent background hum in my life. Then, about 5 years ago, I got a call from a woman who had grown up down the road from my grandparents. We had been casual friends as kids. She was calling to catch up, but she also had a strange story to tell. She was still friends with the family who had bought the old house. She told me that during the renovation, when they were tearing out the walls in my old bedroom to replace the insulation, they had found something. Tucked away inside the wall cavity, right behind the spot where the head of my bed used to be, they found a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside it was a collection of bizarre and horrifying items. There was a handful of my grandmother's prize-winning rose petals, dried and pressed. There was a small, blurry photograph, clearly taken from outside at night, through the window. It was a picture of me, sleeping in my bed. And tucked beside it was a single, yellowed child's molar. The dentist confirmed it wasn't mine. To this day, I have no idea whose tooth it was, or how he got into the walls of that house. I only know that he was much closer than I ever could have imagined.